The Sony FE 300mm f2.8 G Master is actually the lightest 300mm 2.8 lens that currently exists for any full-frame camera. It weighs a bit less than 1.5 kilo, which means it's practically the same weight as my 100 to 500mm f4.5 to f7.1. And this lightweight and also the small size not only make it great for flight shots, where it's just nice if you can handhold it a bit better, but it's also cool because you can quite easily fit it in your backpack next to a bigger lens, such as a 600mm f4. And I know many other wildlife and especially bird photographers that like to have this big 600mm f4 for smaller and shyer birds, but for occasions, as I mentioned, for example, if you have flight shots or if the animal gets a bit closer or if you want to include a bit more of the environment, it's nice to have a second, a bit smaller lens. And since this is so physically small, you can usually quite easily fit it in the backpack next to the big lens. And I was very curious to test this one because I have as well a 300mm 2.8, but mine is a zoom. I have the RF 100 to 300mm f2.8 from Canon that is sitting up here. And I was very curious how the 300mm f2.8 from Sony performs with tele extenders, because with my 100 to 300 2.8, I know that adding a 2-point extender is not really ideal. And even when I tested the 400mm 2.8, so a prime lens from Sony last year, I was a bit disappointed with the performance of the lens with the 2-point extender. So I was curious how this will perform, and I will also talk about the usability, the autofocus, image stabilizer, talk about potential downsides that might still exist for this lens. So in this video you will learn if this lens might be the right choice for you or maybe not. It's a bit hard to believe that this is actually a 300mm f2.8 because it's just too light and too small, and that's a really good thing. It's so much fun to use in the field, especially for flight shots of more like erratic flying birds, provided that they are close enough, because you don't have this momentum that you have from a rather large and heavy telephoto lens. Another advantage is if you have some, let's say, a bit more creative shooting angles, and in some situations I was on a boat and I needed to hold the lens upside down and use the flip screen and shoot like this. And obviously for situations like that, it's so much easier with a lens that is so lightweight as this one. The same maybe if you need to find a hole in a bush or other vegetation to photograph through and you want to incorporate this autofocus foreground. And also here you can actually shoot it with one hand. It's maybe not very recommendable, but it works. And I was actually taking pictures of nutcrackers the other day, and to make them fly towards me I was throwing some hazelnuts to them. And the problem is that they're very smart birds, and they see when you throw the hazelnut and they immediately fly down. So my problem was I was throwing a hazelnut, grabbed the camera, and the action was already over. So I started to just take the camera in one hand, take the hazelnut in the left hand, throw the hazelnut and shoot basically the flying nutcracker with one hand. Again, maybe not how you should do it, but it was surprising that this actually worked with a 300mm f2.8. So let's have a closer look at this lens. As I mentioned, a bit below 1.5 kilograms. The total length without the lens hood is 26.5 centimeters, which is very short. Diameter 12.5 centimeters. This is the physics of the front element, because of the aperture needs to be a bit larger. Otherwise, if we look at the kind of features of the lens, we have different switches here: autofocus, manual focus, the direct manual focus. Then the focus limiter, we have the full range, or 6 meters to infinity. That's certainly good for sport photography. For wildlife, I would have also wished a shorter distance, something like 2 meters, which is the minimum focus distance of this lens. 2 meters until 10 meters or something. That can be nice if you have some songbirds or something a bit closer. It's also something that I actually miss with my RF 100 to 300mm. And then last but not least, you have the optical image stabilizer on off and the modes 1, 2 and 3. Just behind the switches you have the drop-in filter where you can add a polarizer or neutral density filter if you want to. The tripod collar here goes very smoothly. I would have liked if there would be a slight click every time you hit a 90-degree angle. I think the 400mm 2.8 G Master does have this click, but I'm not sure anymore. What I would also have liked is to have some basically some holders for a camera strap. I don't use a camera strap that often, but sometimes I use two cameras at the same time, like a 28-70 and a 300mm, and I have them both around my shoulder, and then I need a camera strap. I don't know if the idea from Sony is that you use the ones on the camera because the lens is quite lightweight. I don't know. I would have preferred to have these clips here. The tripod foot can be removed quite easily. You just open this screw, hold this button, and then you can slide it out. This is actually the reason why Sony doesn't even include this in the weight of the lens, in the official weight. If you want to use it on a tripod, you will obviously need an Arca Swiss plate, or what I would suggest is rather replace the foot because it's quite short. It works great for hand holding like this. You can easily reach the focus ring and the function buttons and everything. But if I'm walking around in nature, it's so short that I have problems. I can put 2 fingers, but with gloves, even 2 fingers is kind of stretching it. And I don't want to hold this whole lens with only 1 finger. So I would anyway change it for something a bit larger, but as we change all the tripod foots anyway, not so much of a deal. The focus ring, as I mentioned, it's big and it's in a very comfortable position to reach. Just in front we have this function ring, which by default, I think if you turn it for a bit longer, it sets the focus preset, and if you turn it quickly, it recalls the focus preset. And then we have this 4-lens function button that you can configure to do pretty much whatever you want, and of course all of the 4 do the same thing. It's just that if you shoot horizontal or vertical, you can always reach one easily. In front we obviously have the lens hood, but unlike many other super telephoto lenses, you don't have this screw to tighten or lose it, but rather a kind of a clip mechanism, and then you need to do a 90-degree rotation. It's probably personal preference what works better. I think this is a very well designed clip thing. I also had some in the past that were a bit harder to fit, or they were kind of blocked at some point, and I feel like this one works quite easily. What I don't like so much is now when it comes to protecting the front element, what Sony delivers is actually this more traditional cover that you put over here, and it's quite large. I mean, it's bigger than the whole lens hood, and I just prefer a lens cap. For example, for the RF300-300, Canon gives a lens cap, and I think this is a much nicer solution. And because this is actually larger than the lens hood, it sometimes makes it even harder to remove it once you have the lens hood inverted. And I'm not sure if this is actually maybe from the old 300mm f2.8 that was still larger. I'm not sure. Anyway, as I mentioned, I would probably go for a replacement or aftermarket lens cap. So enough about the exterior. How is the image quality? As you would expect, it's excellent. I was shooting wide open for most of the time, and the image quality is phenomenal. It's super sharp, and also another important aspect, the camera lens combination delivers consistently sharp images, so a high keeper rate. I also added the 1.4 extender, and I saw basically no drop in sharpness. It's still amazingly sharp, still super high keeper rate. And then finally I added the 2x extender to get a 600mm f5.6 equivalent. And with this I saw I would say a minimal loss in sharpness. But maybe more importantly, the consistency went a bit down. So meaning instead of 99% images being tag sharp, maybe only 85% were tag sharp, and the other 15 were slightly soft, maybe still usable, but slightly softer. But overall, this lens handles teleconverters extremely well. Also in terms of autofocus, and as I mentioned, in terms of image quality. And I wanted to do some side-by-side comparison to my RF 100-300. And what I noticed already without extenders is that the Sony files are a bit sharper. I'm super happy with the sharpness of the RF 100-300mm without extenders. It's very sharp. So I'm not quite sure if maybe also the Sony files, like not the lens, but the camera files, are a bit sharper by default. They seem to have a tiny bit more noise, but also more detail. So I'm wondering if Canon is kind of putting more noise reduction, or the AA filter is like stronger for the Canon. I don't know. That's just something I noticed. But without extenders, both are very sharp. With the 1.4 extenders, basically no drop here, minimal drop with the 100-300 from Canon. And with the 2x extender, I felt that I saw the biggest difference. The Canon was still usable, but you saw clearly that the sharpness dropped, whereas here with the Sony 300mm 2.8, even with the 2x extender, it was very, very sharp. And I need to say that I did all these tests wide open. If you would stop down, you would probably get even more sharpness, but I want to often shoot wide open if I buy such expensive and fast lenses. The autofocus of this lens is very fast and it's very quiet. I mean, I can barely hear it. It's noticeably more quiet than, for example, my RF 100-300. And the image stabilizer also works very quietly and it works very well. I did some direct comparisons to the RF 100-300. So I did some handheld shots at 300mm at 1/10 of a second. And with the Sony, I got around 20% of the images that they were either completely sharp or at least usable sharp. And with the RF 100-300, it was around 40%. So the Canon had a bit better image stabilizer. I also had this feeling already when I was taking pictures and just looking through the viewfinder, or when I was doing video actually. I also had the feeling that the Sony shakes a little bit more, but it's definitely not a big difference. And for both lenses, camera combinations, the image stabilizer works very well. So overall, I really had a lot of fun with this lens. I got many nice images. And it's very interesting to see, because this is the newest super telephoto lens from Sony. The RF 100-300 is the newest super telephoto lens from Canon. They are both 300mm and still they are completely different. Sony and Canon went a completely different way. Basically, Sony said, let's build the lightest, most compact, but razor sharp 300mm we can do. And Canon basically decided to replace 70-200 and 300mm 2.8 into one lens that is 100-300mm, which is much more versatile, but also heavier, and image quality suffers a bit. Which one is right for you depends on your needs. If you're often taking pictures with the 600mm f4 and you think you will just sometimes use the 300mm, maybe for flight shots, but in general you need a bit more focal length, then this makes more sense. On the other hand, if I go taking pictures of ibex, I often need the whole range between 100-300mm, also because I want to have the whole ibex in the picture, then I want to go more for a portrait, or I want to include more of the landscape. And if I would have had Sony, I would need to have the 300mm 2.8 hanging around my shoulder, and over the older shoulder a second camera with a 70-200. So it really depends a bit what you want to do. Another situation I think where the 300mm 2.8 from Sony is better is if you maybe say that in your region the birds are not so shy and they're rather big, so often 300mm or let's say 420 is enough, and only rarely you need to go to 600. Then maybe you don't even need to buy a 600mm and take a second lens, but this is your primary lens. And then again, I think this one makes more sense because the 300mm 2.8 from Sony takes tele extenders really well, and also it's just fun to use such a light lens. Of course, if you're already invested in one system, it probably makes sense to stick there, except you have a really compelling reason to switch. But I think in this case, you did not have needed to watch this video here. One last point that I want to mention is the price. The RF 100-300 costs in the US around $9,500. This one is $6,000. So the 100-300 is around 50% more expensive. And even if you buy this 300mm 2.8 and a 70-200mm, you're still cheaper than the 100-300. So this might also be an important factor. I also mentioned the size that it takes in the backpack. If you want to buy the lens, please check out the affiliate links that I put in the video description. It would greatly help me to support the channel.